Well, hello everyone. The last time we talked, we were discussing why the Articles of Confederation resulted in a fairly weak federal government, and that although the states were happy about that for a while because the states had a lot of independent power, the way that they did back in the colonial period as independent colonies in a way, from each other that is, what ends up happening is we've got the Articles of Confederation basically not able to provide the type of government that a country actually needs to have. And that involved the fact that it was very difficult for the federal government to raise taxes to pay Revolutionary War debts or to pave the way for treaties for trade or to basically deal with problems between the states. And so the federal government being so weak couldn't really do much. And in that case, they were ineffective. One of the most ineffective displays, of course, of federal government power was Shays' Rebellion. And Shays' Rebellion we already talked about in the last lecture a little bit, but as a quick reminder, this is a situation in which, because the states were completely on their own as far as what they got to do, the states were able to raise taxes just fine, and the states could have their own class system. Just remember, there was no Bill of Rights at this point, nor was there a constitution, so the states basically acted like their own little kingdoms. And Massachusetts, ironically, since this was the place where the Revolutionary War started, it's ironic to me that Massachusetts would be the state where there would be another rebellion right after the War of Independence ended. And the rebellion was almost like a microcosm of the revolution. You have in Massachusetts a government that is going to treat the working class basically like it's nothing, like it doesn't matter. There's no power given to it. And so the working class is finding that wealthy people in Massachusetts are given all the power, and those wealthy people are either cheating farmers out of their land, or the government is cheating farmers out of their land by raising taxes and rent so high that the farmers, who themselves were many of them soldiers of the Revolutionary War period, so they're recently now veterans, and they haven't even been paid by the federal government yet because the federal government doesn't have its act together. And so Massachusetts is saying, well, you guys owe us all these taxes. If you can't pay, we're taking your land so that our wealthy guys can take it from you. And isn't that great, right? And so this is a real problem. Now, normally Congress or the Supreme Court especially would get involved in something like this, but since Congress has no power and there is no Supreme Court yet, there's not even really an executive office even either. These guys are sort of screwed. And so what that means is that these farmers in Massachusetts are going to be on their own, and they're used to this. So what they're going to do is what they've always had to do whenever things were bad, especially related to a local government who was misbehaving, which is to form a small army called a militia, and Daniel Shays will be in charge of it. He's got a lot of experience from the Revolutionary War, and the end result is you've got a rebellion in Massachusetts. And there's every evidence to show that there were other rebellions about to come in a number of other states as well. This is not a really great system when you end up with a situation where the federal government can't do anything to force the states to be more fair towards their people, where the federal government cannot put down rebellions, which are going to be dangerous, and the federal government cannot even basically defend itself. I mean, the government was useless. And so the end result is that you're going to finally have people, as Shays' Rebellion is going through Massachusetts, and other rebellions in other states are on the way. It's only a matter of time that lawmakers throughout the states are going to finally get together and say, listen, we have to make a better government. And so one of the biggest supporters of this, of course, is going to be George Washington, very supportive of the idea of making a more powerful federal government that could actually steer the ship a little bit, if that makes any sense. And so that brings us to our topic today, which is the U.S. Constitution is a document that is going to be created largely out of fear of what a weak federal government was currently bringing to the country, which was a lot of chaos and disarray. And so it's 1787 when Declaration of Independence is going to be the preamble, not to the Articles of Confederation, but finally a preamble to the Constitution. And so let's talk a little bit about the Constitution, what it is, how it's changed from the Articles, and that'll be our main topic today. So the Constitutional Convention, the main issue there, has to do with what kind of government are we going to set up with this new system. And what is discussed is the idea of there being a democratic republic. Okay, now a lot of people like to call America a democracy, and that's partially true, but it's not really fully true. True democracy would be something like maybe ancient Athens, where everybody that was allowed to vote would all show up in person at the Acropolis, the governing center of Athens, and they would all spend weeks listening to arguments as citizens, and then they would vote on things. Well, that was impractical. I mean, you've got a country that's already quite large and spread out, and the idea of having everybody in the country all show up in Washington or something, right, and try to vote on things was just ridiculous. And so how do you have a democracy when you have a big country and it's not just a city-state like Athens was? And the answer was, well, we need a bigger version of democracy, which is a democratic republic. What is a democratic republic? It is where everybody gets to vote on who their politicians are going to be, who are their representatives going to be, and it's those representatives that will go to Washington, D.C., and they will represent the people. So basically, you're going to hire, through taxpayer dollars and chosen by the voters, you're going to hire politicians to do the job full time so that the common citizen could get back to work and doing what they're doing, raising families and so on and so forth. And so this democratic republic is going to be based upon ideas that have been discussed in the philosophies of men like Montesquieu, Rousseau, and John Locke. And it's going to be an experiment, which has seen the test of time so far, but has had a lot of changes happen to it over the course of time as well. So basically the idea is that representatives will have to be selected to represent the people, and it's the people who can vote for those representatives, and it's the people who could remove those representatives from their jobs. And in this way, you basically keep true to the Enlightenment ideals that people have the right to replace a government that becomes tyrannical. That it's a government of the people and for the people. And even today, we have seen in the last elections, we saw a number of people kicked out of their offices in Congress and in the Senate, and new people put in, because that is the power that the public has. They can change who their government is to a certain extent. Okay, so that's really it. Well, obviously, when you're dreaming this whole idea up, there's going to be people that want to figure out how to make it fair, because there's a lot of political power at stake when you're creating a new government. And so you have these two parties that are going to form, and they're really the basis of America's very first political parties. One of them is called the Federalists. The Federalists are going to be the group of Americans who argue for a more powerful federal government. Federalists would include people like George Washington and John Adams, for instance. They are the ones that think that a federal government needs to be something that can actually lead the country. It needs to have enough power to actually do the job. For instance, raise taxes, be able to hire an army if necessary, be able to stop rebellions from happening, and maybe even regulate the states a little bit, which is not yet happening, right? So they needed all of this. The anti-federalists were the ones that are naturally afraid of the federal government becoming too powerful, maybe even becoming as powerful as the Empire of Great Britain over America. And so the anti-feds wanted, it's not that they didn't want a federal government, they just didn't want it to be very powerful, and they kind of liked the way it was, but they wanted to find a couple ways to make it better. And so I want to mention that today. Today in America, every political party, including the two main ones, are all on the spectrum of more federalism or less federalism. They're all in the spectrum. They all evolve from these ideals of how strong should the government be compared to how weak should it be, so as to protect the rights of the people from, say, tyranny, right? So everybody has a different idea of what that is, and here you go. All right. So here's the biggest thing that comes then, the biggest debate, which is, if we're going to create a democratic republic, then what happens as far as how we decide on who gets to be representatives of all the people? And so I'm going to read this slide because that's just something you do. Oops. Well, that didn't work. Once it was understood that America would have a legal government based upon democratically elected representatives, the next debate was this: how to balance the power of the big states versus the small states. The basic idea was that the big states, if the representation of people going to Congress is going to be based off of folks getting elected from the population. So let's say Virginia and Pennsylvania and New York all were big states. Also South Carolina and North Carolina, big states. And so theoretically, if you're going to have this democratic republic, you're going to base the representatives that go to Congress to represent all the people in your state. To do that, you need to have the amount of representatives that go to Congress based on the population of your state. So those bigger states are theoretically going to be able to send more people to Congress than the small states. And that means the small states will always be weaker in the government than the big states will be. And so the small states are really nervous about this idea of a democratic republic. Small states would include states like Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, and more. Okay? So that's our situation. So the question then is this, right? Should the states send representatives to Congress based upon the population of that state, or should each state simply send 2 people per state to represent the state? Okay, that's the big question that's going to be behind the Constitution. And so the big states love this idea of a Congress based upon population because that gives more representatives to those big states, and those big states will always win votes in Congress. Now, the small states, of course, as I just mentioned, see this as being horribly unfair, and they really want to have an equal voice in Congress. And so they're the ones saying, well, we should just have 2 people per state. Here's the deal. I want you to imagine California, okay? California has nearly 40 million people in it. Delaware has about 700,000 people in it. Are they equal in population? Not even close. However, is Delaware going to be kind of unfairly treated if California gets to send 50 representatives to Congress and Delaware only gets to send 1 or 2 or 3? Right? So that's kind of the big deal, is how do you make that equal? So Delaware will be the state that says, let's just send 2 people per state to Congress and that's it. Whereas California will say, no, we have too many people. If we want a true democratic republic, we have to be able to send enough people to represent all the different geographical and ethnic regions of our state. And it's a big state. Therefore, we need to have more than 2 people. Okay, I mean, Fresno's nothing like San Diego, and San Diego is nothing like San Francisco, and San Francisco is nothing like Humboldt, or LA, right? Everything's different. So you have to have representatives from all those different regions, and that's just the natural way to do a republic, where everybody gets a voice by selecting representatives for them directly from their region. So that's what we're talking about here. So here is the compromise that's going to solve this problem. The Virginia plan is we need to have each state send representatives based upon the population of that state. So big states get more reps. Haha, we have power that way. New Jersey's plan, of course, is let's just send 2 people per state. And as I already expressed, these 2 plans make sense for their size of state, but they don't make sense for equality across the spectrum. The compromise that's going to finally be reached is let's simply take both of these ideas and make them into Congress. So a bicameral legislature means that you have 2 houses. You have 2 groups, okay, bicameral. And there is a lower house and an upper house. In the lower house, we will call this specifically the House of Representatives, okay? The House of Representatives is based upon the big state plan, which means it's really big. The House of Reps has something like 500-something people in it today, I think, and it is based upon how many people live in each state. And so California sends more than 50 representatives to the House of Representatives every time we elect more. So we have a lot of them, right? And so do all the other big states, and the small states have only a few in comparison, which is not fair. And then, I mean, it's fair to the people, it's not really fair to the power dynamic in Congress. And so we have the upper house, which is today also called the Senate. And in the Senate, that's a much smaller body because there's 2 people, basically a total of 100 people because we have 50 states. There's 2 people per per state that goes there. So that's the small state plan. So we took both of these and shoved them into the Capitol building, and we call it Congress. Okay, so this is a different kind of Congress than existed under the last government. And the idea is that whenever somebody proposes a law, which is called a bill in Congress, it has to be approved by the House of Representatives, and it has to be approved by the Senate. And it's in the Senate where a lot of laws go to die, because in the Senate you have the small states are able to gang up and really have a lot of power there. And if this bill that is being proposed comes out of the House, usually what happens is it's going to really support big states. Often is the case because the big states have the most power there. And so that bill goes to the Senate, and the Senate says, well, that's not fair to us small states. We're ganging up and we're voting it down. All right, that's a very simplistic way to look at it, but that's basically how you try to equalize the power dynamic between big and small states in our version of a democratic republic. And so here's the Capitol building. And at the Capitol building, you have got this beautiful large building, and you basically have an upper house and a lower house. And basically what you have is a House of Representatives that's kind of big right here, and you have the Senate up here. Over here is the Supreme Court. Okay, so this is your big giant building here, which has it's much bigger than it looks from here, but basically you kind of see how big it is. There's all these little people right there. Anyway, so there's that. By the way, this is often confused by new visitors to Washington D.C. as being the White House. This is not the White House, of course. The White House is over here on this side, and it's just, I think people are surprised that our president lives or works in a much smaller building than, say, the Capitol. But the deal is that Congress is a much bigger deal in our government than the president is. That's always the case. And so they have a much bigger building for which to house all the things that they do. There's the White House, right? It's really just a antebellum mansion, right? It's all this really is. Whereas if you go over here, there's the Capitol building. So that's the difference. Okay, what does the Constitution then say our government should look like? Real simple. 3 branches. There's a legislative branch, of course, a judicial, which didn't exist before, and a executive, which didn't exist before. So let's start with the major jobs of the legislative branch. Firstly, they make laws. That's their job. They're the representatives of the people, and they need to help people, and they do so by making laws. They control the money, so tax dollars are used by Congress. They can veto a presidential decision if they wish to do so, so that's their power, their check and balance against the president. They can veto what the president wants to do. They can impeach a president if a president is deemed to be someone that needs to be removed from office. The impeachment is just a trial that leads to a possible removal, as you already know from recent events. It's just an investigation. Let's see. They can approve treaties. The president can make treaties, but he can't implement them. It's Congress that actually approves them on behalf of the people. They declare war. If we go to war, the people have to decide to do so, and we do so through our representatives. Okay, so the president can say, "I want to go to war," but nothing will happen on a large scale unless Congress says, "Okay, we're going to war." Mostly because guess who has the power of the money? That's right, Congress. How about this? What are the major jobs of the president? Signs proposed laws that Congress sends to him called bills into law, or the president can deny those bills and send them back to Congress. Sometimes that's just to get them rewritten, and sometimes it's just because the president doesn't want to be the president that enacts that particular law. Somehow he disagrees with it. The president can appoint a Supreme Court justice to a life term. We'll talk in a minute as to why Supreme Court justices have a life term. And the president's real job, the executive office, is to enforce the law. So the military is going to be the job of the president. The FBI, the CIA, the Coast Guard, they all work at the pleasure of the president, okay? And so Congress might make the laws, but the president is in charge of enforcing the laws on a national level. Of course, the states have their own law enforcement, and at a state level, the states will follow the federal example, and they have similar governments, and they have control, the states, of the National Guard and state police and that sort of thing. Okay, how about the Supreme Court? Well, there's 9 justices on the Supreme Court. That's all. That's all there are, 9 people. and their entire job is to interpret the Constitution. And so they can declare what a politician does in Congress or in the White House as being legal or illegal in regards to constitutionality. And they also decide on big cases between states and between major plaintiffs and things that have gone through the court system throughout the entire country where it's applicable and made it all the way up to the Supreme Court for a final decision because it's just been too much of a problem for smaller courts to handle. And so the Supreme Court has to be these 9 people that are free of political intrigue. And so the Supreme Court, those 9 people are really, if we think in ancient terms, are basically our high priests. They are the sages whose entire job is to be pure enough to interpret the Constitution and the history of American law and apply it to major decisions. And what that means is they need to be non-influenceable. They have to be pure, so to speak. That's the ideal anyway. And that means that if a Supreme Court justice votes a certain way based on their belief in what the Constitution means about something, we need to know that the Supreme Court justice is not going to get imprisoned, or that Supreme Court justice is not going to be fired. And we need to know that the Supreme Court justice is well enough off that that person is not going to be, oh, look, here's a bribe, right, from Congress. So basically the deal is that the Supreme Court is its own court. It's its own special, almost, again, I say it's almost like a priesthood whose job it is to understand everything there is to know about the Constitution and apply it to anything that comes across their court. Okay, so those are our 3 branches. Oh, and that's also why they serve a life term, because there's a lot of background knowledge that has to be gained during the time that you're a Supreme Court justice, and it needs to be possible for people to not be influenced by term limits and all that too. They have to be solid geeks of the Constitution, so to speak. Okay, a quick point here about checks and balances, you guys. What makes it so that each of these branches doesn't actually take over the entire government at some point? It's checks and balances that were written in by our convention. They're pretty simple. The Congress, the legislative branch, the lawmakers, Congress, they can overrule judicial decisions if enough people vote. They can even remove a Supreme Court justice who's serving for a life term if enough people vote. That's what they can do with the judicial branch. The checks that the legislative has on the president, the executive branch, are that if the executive, the president, appoints somebody to be part of his government that Congress doesn't like, Congress can say no. Congress can reject presidentially made treaties. Congress controls the funding. They're in charge of the Treasury, so the president has a limited amount of power there too. Congress can impeach a president, and Congress can override a veto that the president went ahead and said no to a bill that Congress sent in. Congress can all vote with a massive vote. They could actually overturn that veto. That doesn't happen often, but it's been known to come close. The judicial branch. What does the Supreme Court have over the other 2 branches? It's real simple. They can declare anything that the legislative or the executive branch does as being unconstitutional, and those rules have to be followed. That's an important thing. There have been presidents that have gotten away with disobeying a Supreme Court decision. We'll talk about Andrew Jackson in a couple of weeks because he's one of them, one of the first, and he gets away with it. Because he was a very popular president during his time. And that's not a good thing. It's just, it is possible to sometimes have a moment where one branch is just a little bit more powerful than the others. Let's see. Executive branch. The president. What is his power? He can veto bills, as we already know. He can actually close down Congress for a very short time in very certain situations. It's rare, but he can do it. And he has the job of appointing judges. This last bit, is probably the biggest part of what a president can do. When somebody retires from being a lifetime term Supreme Court justice, the president has the job of appointing a new one. And a president will obviously want to appoint a justice that interprets the Constitution the way the president and the president's party interprets the Constitution, either a bit more liberally or a bit more conservatively. So a president just pines away for the opportunity to support a justice. Obama got to actually put in 2, almost 3. which, that would have been 1/3 of the entire Supreme Court would have been Obama appointed if that had happened. And it just comes around like that every now and then. So basically, the court, although it interprets the Constitution, the political leaning, if you will, the ideology of the Supreme Court justice is always going to lean a little bit to the left or to the right, and that's where the president can have that long-term power, long after that president is out of office, is how the court is identifying the Constitution based on who got put in there, right? So that's a huge power that the president has. So these are all checks and balances where one branch hopefully does not get more powerful than the other branches. Okay, last thing that's finally going to happen. You'll notice that these say that they're amendments. What happened is that the Constitution here, it actually got approved before the Bill of Rights and before the Constitution listed any kind of rights of the people that applied to the whole country. And so what happened is a number of states refused to sign the Constitution, and they said the reason was because there was no Bill of Rights. There was no indication of what the rights of the people were guaranteed by the Constitution. And so finally, the last major argument is going to be this, which is, well, we better decide what the rights of the people are. And Britain already had a Bill of Rights, so the US one is going to be a little bit of a copy of some of it, and then you're going to see some of these that are actually based upon our own experience. And so the freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, petition, commonly believed things in Britain and the United States by the time we get to the 1780s. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, that's a very American thing, and it's an American tradition because back in the colonial period, American colonists were on their own. There was no standing army from Britain or anywhere else to protect them, and so the colonists had to be armed. They were required to be most of the time, and they had to practice as militias in case they were ever attacked. And so the end result is that it becomes a tradition that you actually have weapons in the hands of the people, which was not all that common around the world, except in certain places like the United States. So what that means, right? There's lots of arguments about what the Second Amendment means. If you want to know what the Founding Fathers thought about it, go to the Federalist Papers. You can find them online. And in the Federalist Papers are a bunch of essays from the Founding Fathers, especially in the case of the Second Amendment, as to what Hamilton, who was part of deciding what the wordage was with this. Hamilton writes about what this means. Should the government be able to regulate the right to bear arms in any way? Hamilton says yes, and then he provides why and how. And so if you want to read about that more, it's all about the Federalist Papers. It'll help you win lots of arguments on Facebook. Okay, the Third Amendment provides restrictions on quartering troops. That's because of the old Townshend days when Lord Townshend, just after the Revolutionary War, was trying to get Americans to obey his new restrictive rules and higher taxes without representation. And so he sent soldiers to go live with people, especially in Massachusetts, to watch them. And so no longer will this ever be allowed, right? The Fourth Amendment bans unreasonable search and seizure. People are used to this one. This is a good one. Remember, every state interprets this one a little bit differently. And if somebody feels like their state is a little bit too lax in enforcing this, then you have to take it to a federal court. Okay, to the actual U.S. Supreme Court at sometimes ultimately. And then I think I'll stop with this one. The Fifth Amendment is huge. Protects the citizens against self-incrimination. Okay, that's the big part. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're not used to this yet, especially if you watch a lot of crime dramas, there's something you need to know. If you are ever hauled in for questioning by anybody in law enforcement, unless it's you being a witness to a crime where you're not in any case in trouble, okay? If you are being accused of a crime, or if you are under suspicion in any way, you should say nothing. You should always say nothing, except for one phrase, which is, I want to see my lawyer. And if you don't have a lawyer, then the court has to give you one. So it may not be the best lawyer in the world, but any lawyer is better than no lawyer when trying to get through a complicated legal system. So remember, I want to see my lawyer. You want to say that because you have rights. The Fifth Amendment gives you the right to not be interrogated by, say, the police until you've had legal counsel so you know what to say and how to say it. That's an important distinction in our government that comes out of the old days of say, the law in Massachusetts that led to things like the witchcraft trials and all that, right? We are under this system, innocent until proven guilty. Okay, that's really good. Innocent until proven guilty. But sometimes people will try to get you to confess to a crime that you may or may not have committed, and you need a lawyer always. Okay. The rest of this, whatever you want to do, if we're going to have live office hours this semester, I'm still working on that. But if you want to ask me questions about any of these or any aspect of what's going on right now in the current day that I might have an opinion on or something, feel free to do so during those office hours, including if it's any of these. You know, I love to talk to people about stuff like this. You'll talk more about it in a government class, which is also government is also a general ed requirement. So at some point, if you haven't yet, you'll be having to take one. Okay. Last topic, you guys, thank God, right? The Whiskey Rebellion. Okay, so the deal is during the Articles of Confederation, there was this rebellion called Shays' Rebellion, right? We already talked about this, and it was frustrated farmers who felt like they were being treated in a tyrannical fashion by their government in Massachusetts. Well, now we have a constitution in 1787. The Constitution is enacted. It's got its checks and balances, and it's a much stronger federal system, and Congress can even raise taxes now. Yay for Congress, which means they can start paying off debt and raise money for the government and do things with it, okay? And so why is there suddenly a rebellion, okay? I thought we had fixed all this stuff. Well, here's the deal. This is the first real test of the U.S. Constitution. It's 1791, and the federal government is already taxing certain imports and exports. Keep in mind, the federal government is not taxing income yet. That's something that happens much, much later in history. The government's not taxing property yet. It's only taxing imports and exports. It's taxing trade. And a lot of that money that comes from taxing trade is going to be used to help improve trade. Road systems, seaports, eventually a navy that's going to protect American merchant ships from predators, that sort of thing, right? Ambassadors paying ambassadors to go to foreign nations and negotiate treaties, that sort of thing. And so if you tax trade, you want to use the trade money to help influence better trade. Is the right? You got to pay for something to get something. So in 1791, the government is going to tax whiskey from Pennsylvania. And whiskey was a very big product, meaning it was a very popular product, and American whiskey was kind of like the American version of vodka, you know, and people bought it. And so the deal is that the government saw all these profits coming from whiskey from Pennsylvania going to Europe. And so the federal government says, well, let's put a little tax on that, right? We're helping them to trade with Europe. Why don't we have them pay a little bit for the privilege? And there's suddenly a rebellion of angry Western Pennsylvanians who say, how dare you tax us? That's not fair. You're killing our profits. And that's true. The farmers who grew the grains that went into whiskey had a very narrow profit margin, like super narrow. And what that means is that these farmers were unable to really make a lot of money. And it's because of how much it costs not to make whiskey, but how much it cost to transport whiskey. Whiskey was expensive to move because they're big barrels put onto horse or ox carts, and those horse or ox carts dragged the whiskey over the Appalachian Mountains from where the stuff was made down into the forests that didn't have that. There were no roads. This was an era of time where roads did not exist in America because the infrastructure wasn't there to build and maintain them. And so whenever you went over land somewhere, especially in the frontier, you had to bring a bunch of people with you to make roads, to like carve out new roads. And then the rains would come and the snows would come and the foliage would grow back and your road's gone. So it was expensive to move whiskey from Western Pennsylvania to a seaport. And so these guys, their costs of transportation were so high that their profits were really quite low. So when the government does its job and it actually raises a 10% tax on whiskey sales, the farmers go crazy because their profits are now gone because of this, right? And so I want to mention this. The Whiskey Rebellion is something you want to compare with Shays' Rebellion. Okay, the Whiskey Rebellion happens because whiskey farmers feel like their government is acting tyrannically and unfairly. Shays' Rebellion happens for the same reason. But what you want to compare, if this question shows up on the final exam, is you want to compare Shays' Rebellion during the Articles of Confederation government era to the Whiskey Rebellion during the Constitution era. What did the government do in each case, respectively? How did they help or not help? Okay, because really this is the first test of the federal government. Is the constitutional government going to actually help in this case? And the answer to the first part of this question, the Articles of Confederation government could almost do nothing to help with Shays' rebellion at all. And in juxtaposition, the federal government under the Constitution can do a lot to deal with the Whiskey Rebellion. Okay, so let's go through this real quick and close this down. Here we are, right here, western Pennsylvania in the frontier. It's 370 miles away from the nearest seaport over in New York. Okay, so Pennsylvania is in a place where, western Pennsylvania, where all these whiskey farmers were. These guys are a long ways away, which means that they have to transport their whiskey from here somewhere, from here somewhere, all the way over to here, 370 miles, having to make a new road every time. And you have to bring about 20 or 30 people with you because you need people to protect the caravan. You need people to manage and take care of the horses or oxen. You need people that can repair the carts when an axle breaks or what have you. Remember, these are uneven roads. You need people that can actually hack down trees and foliage and make way for your cart. Okay, so it's at least 3 months to get from here to here, and that's super expensive. And these carts can only carry 3 or 4 big barrels of whiskey. And so this is expensive and ridiculous is what this is. And so it costs so much that, again, when the federal government slaps a 10% tax on whiskey sales, it kills their profits because of how much it costs to transport whiskey. So the government has to be able to do a few things when a rebellion breaks out. One, they have to stop the rebellion because you need to protect property and life and liberty, right? That's the job of the government under our system. So you have to be able to do that, and you have to be able to find out how to make people's lives better. And to do that, the federal government needs to figure out how to get whiskey farmers a better way to ship their cargoes of whiskey to a seaport. Basically, the idea is if you can lessen the cost of transportation of whiskey, then the farmers make more profit, and so that simple 10% tax will no longer seem so bad. Okay? That's the simple bit of it. So Congress says you live right next to a bunch of big rivers like the Ohio River. Eventually, the Ohio River makes its way all the way over to the Mississippi River, and then the Mississippi River floats all the way down to New Orleans. So why not just put your whiskey, you could put a dozen barrels of whiskey, much better than a horse-drawn carriage, a dozen barrels or more of whiskey onto a cheap wooden barge, and simply with 2 people, not 30, but 2, with 2 people, you can float that barge down the river. It's going to take more time. It's 4 months on the Mississippi and 2 months on the Ohio River, right? So that takes more time than by wagon. But it takes 2 people, and you can ship a lot more whiskey this way. And that's what Congress thinks about. It says, well, why don't we tell the whiskey guys to just build barges and ship the whiskey down here to New Orleans, where it'll go to a global market, as opposed to doing it by land this way, which is much harder and takes a lot more work and is much more expensive. And the answer, of course, is, well, why don't the farmers do this? Is because the Mississippi River is owned by Spain. It's owned by Spain, so American farmers can't use it. So here's what the Articles of Confederation government could not do that the new constitutional government could do. First thing, you need to raise soldiers that will go and stop the violence. Okay, you then need a negotiator that's going to talk to the leaders of the rebels and say, well, what is your problem? Well, the tax is too high or whatever, right? And then to say, well, Congress has this idea. Why don't you use the Mississippi? The farmers say, well, we can't. We're not allowed to. It's not owned by us. And the representative can say to the farmers, well, Congress is working on that. Here's what they're going to do. Okay, and so you need this to happen. So here's what's going to happen as a result of the Whiskey Rebellion, this first test of the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. has created this new government. The Whiskey Rebellion happens. Then President Washington is brought out of retirement. He was in retirement. He's brought out of it, gets together 13,000 troops at the behest of Congress, and then goes all the way back to where he used to fight in the French and Indian War. And George Washington is going to be going all the way back to Pittsburgh, in Pennsylvania, and he's going to get there with all these troops, and nobody out there is going to fight him. So the farmers are going to all calm down because nobody wants to touch this guy, and that means that they will settle down to negotiate. And so Washington will then keep things under wraps, keep things peaceful, while Congress, that has the power to do this now with the Constitution, is going to hire an ambassador named Pinckney. And Pinckney is going to go to Spain and create the Pinckney Treaty. And that treaty is going to be one of America's first major trade treaties. And it's this treaty in 1795 between the U.S. and Spain that allows the United States to use the Mississippi River. And therefore, the whiskey producers can use the Mississippi. And what does that mean, ladies and gentlemen? It means that the whiskey farmers can now pay their tax, and it doesn't hurt them too bad because the cost of transportation is so much cheaper. Why? Because Congress was able to do a job. They were able to negotiate the use of the Mississippi, and they were able to raise an army to put down the rebellion, so there was a chance for peaceful discussion on how to solve the problem. There you go, right? So the Constitution came out really shiny in this one. Came out really happy here. And that's it. That's the end of our lecture. Next week, we're going to be talking about something more exciting, I think, which is piracy and angry French people and the United States trying to make its first trade treaty after the war with Britain, which is a little bit of a tragically hilarious story. And we'll even get to Napoleon. So there's all kinds of crazy things happening next week. Talk to you later.